My name is Sam Goldberg. I'm the Director of Education at HERC. And at HERC, we do a lot to bring Holocaust education to the community as well as to schools, which is why I'm so glad I have the opportunity to speak with you guys here. So one of the first things I wanted to share with you is just a little bit of what we do and also opportunities for the teachers on this call to engage with us after this. So for one, we do offer educator programs where either HERC staff or volunteers will come into the classroom to teach your students a 40 to 45 minute engaging, like interactive presentation on specific topics relating to the Holocaust, which I will get into in just a minute. We also have some field trips that are offered by request. One is called From Ignorance and Fear to Knowledge and Understanding, where we have students go to a synagogue and speak to a rabbi about the history of Judaism. And then they go through a workshop on that history of anti-Semitism before hearing a testimony from either a Holocaust survivor or a loved one of a survivor from our Speakers Bureau volunteers. We also work very closely with the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. And every spring they have an exhibit that's more related to the Holocaust where we offer these field trips. This spring we will have an exhibit on Japanese American internment camps. And then we will offer a workshop on dehumanization and propaganda, more relating to the Holocaust, to kind of tie in those two concepts. And again, you have the option to add on a testimony from a survivor. I'll drop my contact information in the chat when we get to the Q&A, but you can email me directly for any of these opportunities, or you can just fill out a form on our website, which is holocaustcentermilwaukee.org. But I'm going to also show a digital training tool that we have worked on. You may have heard Chris McDaniel speak about it. It's called the Holocaust Education Map, and it can be accessed now at teachholocaust.org. And I'm actually going to hopefully share my screen to show you what that looks like. So bear with me while I get that set up. So here is that website. Again, it's teachholocaust.org, and you can sign up for free. And what it really is kind of like a one-stop shop. So we have a learn section where we have a list of the teaching guidelines, some of which I will be going over in my presentation, some of them which Alana had gone through, such as that precision of language and contextualizing the history and translating statistics into people, which was demonstrated so lovely by Susan. So we have this on here just for ease and to reference. We also have a teacher primer, which is all pre-research topics relating to the Holocaust. So before teaching a lesson, you can kind of go through an overview on what these mean. For instance, if you wanted to teach about Nazi racial policy, you can go here and see a little snapshot. We also list where this came from. We have permission from all of these organizations to link to their lovely resources, which I'll go over again as well. But first, I just wanted to also show this 4-domain model, which is really like the center of this website. And it's one of those things that was developed to answer that question of where do I start? The Holocaust is an incredibly expansive history, and there are so many lessons to go over. And I know that just from conversations with students and with teachers that often it's people's like first instinct to teach about the killing centers, the concentration camps, the ghettos, but it's hard to grasp the gravity of what happened in that escalation without first knowing, for instance, the history of anti-Semitism and knowing that it was something that like began and was predominant before the Nazis came to power. And then obviously knowing those escalation, knowing how the Nazis came to power, how they built off that history of anti-Semitism to then use it for their own ideology. We find it very important to study both of those prior to getting into what we call the Holocaust domain, which is those concentration camps, killing centers, and ghettos. And after that, really talking about responsibility, the responsibility of the perpetrators, the responsibility of the international community, and really talking about those individual roles within this domain. So preferably in order, teaching something from each domain here will really provide that well-rounded and rigorous Holocaust education. And quickly, I will just show you what our lesson finder looks like. So you can filter by domains by clicking any of these. If you know that you need to teach on intolerance first. You can also search by the different subjects, topics, lesson features, like if you want primary sources specifically, you could search there. We also have connected all of the Wisconsin social studies standards. So if you're looking for a specific standard to go into your unit to implement this into something you're already teaching, you can go ahead and do it that way. You can look through middle school, high school, or class time. You can also search just by using our search bar if you don't know how to filter, or if you aren't sure what to do. So I'm just going to give an example of what a lesson plan looks like by typing Kristallnacht. And we have this one that's for 9th to 12th grade. And you can see that we actually link to these vetted, well-researched organizations such as the US Holocaust Museum in DC. And we also sometimes will have something by like Facing History or Echoes and Reflections. What we're doing is, what we've created is to make this website to bring all of those resources, because we know there are so many out there and they're so great. But if you don't know what you're looking for, sometimes they can be difficult to really put something together. So the idea is to really just kind of put these all in one place. And you can see that these suggested lesson pairings show the different colors that show the different domains. And just really quickly, before I go back to my PowerPoint, we do have some collections that have already been created. One I created during a different workshop, which has one from each domain already. So you could just save it like that if you have a free login here. But again, so that's teachholocaust.org. I'm always happy to answer any questions about that. It's something we've been working on for a long time, and we have so many lesson plans that we continue to add to it. So I'm going to jump back here and continue on. So again, these 4 domains that I mentioned, these are actually what we use as those educator programs. As I mentioned, those 40 to 45-minute programs that we can go into your classroom to teach. You can choose either intolerance, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, or responsibility. For instance, a lot of educators have some trouble with responsibility or intolerance because those ones are maybe not talked about as much, or can be a little bit complicated. So we are happy to help and kind of be used as like supplementary material or resources to your unit. But then I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about that methodology. So for my first one, I'm going to talk about connect, don't compare. I know that for those of you that were here yesterday and seeing all those different cases of genocide, and the more that you learn about different aspects of the Holocaust and of genocide, you'll see connections and you'll see trends. And it's really important that students make those connections, but it's equally important that they don't compare the different genocides to one another, comparing death counts, asking which one was worse, whose experience was worse. No one wins the trauma Olympics is what we try to say. So making the connections, but not comparing. So the only reason I have these images on top of each other like this is to demonstrate how easy it is to make these comparisons without trying. Like for instance, this kind of diminishes that unique experience of each of these people. But when you go to this slide and you see just the picture of an image from the genocide in Rwanda, where the Belgian colonizers were measuring these physical characteristics of Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa to determine these racial differences. And then again, to this image from the Holocaust where they're measuring a young Polish girl's head, again, trying to determine racial inferiority through physical characteristics. So making those connections, seeing these trends, these warning signs is really very important without making the direct comparisons. And this is another one of those teaching guidelines, but the Holocaust was not inevitable. There is this idea that when students read things in history books that they are, since they're documented, an event took place, that it was meant to happen, but really emphasizing those individual roles and human behavior in talking about that it was the conscious decision to act or not act by individuals, groups, and nations that the Holocaust took place. And as you talk about warning signs, and as you talk about the trends that you saw, noting that there were instances for people to become upstanders rather than bystanders throughout the Holocaust. And we found that that's been a really, I don't want to say popular, but really like engaging topic with students, knowing that they could do things in scenarios that maybe they thought they would be a bystander, like talking about how little things make big differences. The other teaching guideline that I'm going to go over is a big one, so I'm going to break it down a little bit, is making responsible methodological choices. For one, being careful with the use of graphic images. So when choosing imagery, be sure that the material doesn't exploit the student's emotional vulnerability and is not disrespectful to the victims. It isn't difficult to find images of piles of corpses or people being killed. That is out there. If you are looking for resources, if you are looking through archives, it won't take a lot to find that. But just because it's out there doesn't mean it's appropriate for your students. So really making sure that you're using your best judgment to see what's appropriate and asking yourself what you want to get out of this image. If your sole purpose for showing an image is to get a physical or emotional reaction, just kind of think about what it could do, like how, if it could be harmful. For example, I've used an image of a pile of victims' shoes to show the gravity of people that were killed and the individual nature. There are shoes from children, from women, people that like, it shows that individuality, it shows the graphic, it shows an emotional response without being graphic. So when you're thinking about that, maybe a pile of shoes can elicit just as much of a reaction as a pile of corpses, but won't be as traumatizing to students. So that's something that I tend to do. I know that there's also this idea that in teaching the Holocaust and genocide, that if you don't make your students cry, you're not doing it right, which is completely false. But I know that it's there because it's such a heavy topic. You think that if your students start crying, if they're not upset, that maybe you didn't do it right. Maybe you didn't show how bad it really was. But just letting you know that that doesn't have to be the case, and that sometimes getting that physical reaction is a little bit too much. That's kind of maybe a sign that you've gone too far. I always like to tell students that it is a difficult subject. If they need to step outside, if they need to write a journal, if they want to come talk to me afterwards, that they're more than welcome to, and letting them know that it's a safe space to have these conversations. I'm also going to talk about straying from simulation and role play exercises, as Chris McDaniel said. The DPI is planning to issue a formal statement on their stance of these different uses and against them, as many other organizations have in the past. These exercises are really, they trivialize the experience of the victims and can leave students with the impression that they actually know what it was like to experience different aspects of the Holocaust. They can also reinforce negative views of the victims, and they can put students in the position of defending or identifying with the perpetrators. And lastly, they can be emotionally upsetting or damaging to those who identify as victims, who have had bad experiences in the past, or for any number of reasons. This was actually from, as you can see, December 2021, just to really show you that these things are still happening. I can't really speak to this teacher's intent, but for the most part, when I speak to educators that have used role play or immersive experiences, it's not necessarily to be malicious, it's not to be graphic. They really just want their students to feel what it was like. They want students to resonate with the material. They want to make them cry in order to effectively teach the Holocaust, so to speak. But I think we can all agree that something like this is horrible, traumatizing. In Wisconsin, we are not teaching third graders about the Holocaust, but even input any grade level here, and this is inappropriate. So just letting everyone know that this sort of thing does happen in Wisconsin. I've seen and heard from teachers that used to put like duct tape on the floor for the dimensions of a cattle car and shoving students there to kind of feel how packed they were, which again can be traumatizing as well, although not as aggressive as this one here, but also like the choiceless choices, having them try to make these choices and putting themselves in that position of a victim or a perpetrator. So I really just kind of, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me directly. I've had teachers do that too when they're not aware and they're not sure about the impact that a lesson plan they've chosen is. But I think that I'll show at the end some different organizations that are completely trustworthy, that if you find something from their website, those are good to go. Those are green lighted by most Holocaust scholars. Another thing I want to talk about is why the boy in the striped pajamas is problematic. So I know that, again, this isn't taught by teachers because they want to teach the Holocaust this way. It's more of a, people have good judgment. They want to do things correctly. A lot of the times these books were given to schools, said, hey, this is a book to teach about the Holocaust. So I'm not blaming any teacher that has used this in the past. I just warn them of the implications of this book and why it is problematic. So we learn about the main character, Bruno, who is a German boy and the son of a high-ranking Nazi official, and you're instinctively sympathizing with him. You learn about his family. You get a lot of characteristics of him. And on the flip side, Shmuel, the Jewish boy, does not have much personality or individuality. So the audience does not build an emotional connection with him. And then in the end, when the German boy ends up accidentally being considered a Jewish boy and being sent to the gas chambers, the reader's attention is put on sympathizing with the Nazi German family, instead of focusing on the real story that none of the people that were in that gas chamber should have been there, not just the one German boy that got mixed up, but that none of them should have been there in the first place. So again, not knocking any teacher that has used this, I just urge you to go into any of these other resources that are available that have been well researched, and have you sympathizing with the correct person. So again, this isn't just my opinion. I know that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and many, many Holocaust resource centers and museums have urged teachers to reconsider reading The Boy in the Striped Pajamas for that reason. But that's not to say that historical fiction is a problem. It is a great entry point for younger grade levels, for middle school. So I have a couple novels. These are all historical fiction. Obviously, Night and Diary of a Young Girl are excellent testimonies, and there are many more. You can find diaries and memoirs that are good for students. But books that are great historical fiction include Briar Rose, Train, Refugee, Prisoner B3087, and Whitebird. These are all well-researched. The authors made almost as much research as it takes to write a fiction novel or a nonfiction to write their fiction novels. So these are all great resources. And again, a really nice entry point for those younger students that can kind of lead into them listening to testimony and reading these memoirs. Some organizations that I mentioned that I've vetted, that I've worked with, that if you ever need to look for resources, obviously the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is a front runner for me. Facing History in Ourselves, Echoes and Reflections, Yad Vashem, USC Shoah Foundation, and I also threw Unsilence in there. So many of you might not know Unsilence. It's created by the same person who wrote Train. So he's from Danny M. Cohen, and he focuses on the non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust. So he does have these interactive storytelling, which might sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I recommend, if you haven't, to look through his way of telling the story. He has something called the 19th window, where students are kind of being that historian, and they're in the story in a way that's very, very respectful. They're not being put in the place of a victim or perpetrator. They are following the story of a grandchild of a survivor as she tries to research her family's past. So it's very interesting, and it's for students as well. And you will find a reading guide to Train on this website as well. But again, it kind of emphasizes that the other victims, the non-Jewish victims, which sometimes gets overlooked or is a little bit more hidden within the story. So if you're interested in that, I highly suggest taking a look. But that is actually the last of my slides. I wanted to give you plenty of time to ask questions. I will throw my information in the chat as well, just so we can get rid of this screen sharing, because you can't click on that. But I welcome any questions about anything I talked about methodology, about the Holocaust Education Map, whatever you would like to talk about.